The little bell above the door of Rosie's bakery rang once. It was a soft, cheerful sound, the kind nobody usually noticed. But on this Tuesday morning, when it rang, the entire bakery fell silent. Not slowly. All at once. Like a switch had been flipped. A woman at the counter stopped mid-sentence. A man froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Two teenagers by the window looked up from their phones. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 3 men had walked in through the door. The first 2 were enormous. They wore dark suits that pulled tight across their wide shoulders. Their faces were blank and hard, like stone carved into human shapes. They moved in perfect unison, their sharp eyes sweeping the room from left to right and back again. But it was the third man who had stopped the world. He was not as large as the other 2. He didn't need to be. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been made for no one else. His dark hair was combed back neatly. His jaw was sharp. His eyes were the color of midnight, deep, still, and impossible to read. He walked like a man who had never once been in a hurry, because the world always waited for him. His name was Dante Varro. The customers didn't know that name. But somewhere deep inside them, something old and animal understood the danger. They could feel it, the way you feel a storm before the rain arrives. Dante's gaze moved across the bakery the way a searchlight moves across dark water, slow, precise, and looking for something specific. His eyes passed over the frightened customers. They passed over the glass cases full of bread and pastries. They passed over the hand-painted menu on the wall. Then they stopped. Behind the counter, a young woman was wiping down the display case with a yellow cloth. Her back was to him. She was wearing a pale blue apron dusted with flour, and her dark hair was pulled up into a messy knot at the top of her head. She hadn't heard the silence fall across the room. She was humming softly to herself, a quiet little melody that seemed to belong to a completely different world than the one Dante Varro lived in. For one long moment, he didn't move. He just looked at the line of her shoulders, the curve of her neck, the small, familiar way she tilted her head when she was focused on something. He knew those details the way most people know their own name. Something shifted in his face. The cold, bored mask he always wore cracked, just slightly, at the edges. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, curled slowly into fists. He had spent 8 months looking for her. He had turned cities upside down. Spent small fortunes. Sent his best men to 3 different countries and gotten nothing back but silence and dead ends. And here she was. In a small bakery. Wearing a flour-dusted apron. Humming to herself like the world wasn't broken. One of the customers near the door knocked over a sugar dispenser by accident. It hit the tile floor with a sharp crack. The woman behind the counter spun around. Nadia Cole had fast reflexes. She always had. But all her reflexes did for her in that moment was make sure she was looking directly into Dante Varro's eyes when the world as she knew it ended. The yellow cloth slipped from her fingers. She didn't notice. She couldn't notice anything except him, the way he was standing in the middle of her small, safe, flour-dusted world, looking at her like she was a ghost he had spent a long time hunting. For one breathless second, she thought she was imagining it. Then his eyes moved. They dropped from her face, traveled downward, and landed on the front of her apron. On the round, heavy, unmistakable swell of her belly. The breath left her body in one sharp rush, as if someone had pressed hard against her ribs. Her hand flew to her mouth. 7 months. She was 7 months pregnant, and she had been so careful, so completely invisible, that she had almost convinced herself she was safe. She had believed, truly believed, that no one would ever find her here in this small town with its one traffic light and its Tuesday farmers market. She had been wrong. Dante did not move. He stood completely still in the center of Rosie's bakery, and the world around him blurred at the edges. The frightened customers faded. The smell of warm bread faded. The low hum of the refrigerators behind the counter faded. There was only Nadia. And the impossible, undeniable curve of the life she was carrying. He was a man who had looked into the eyes of dangerous men without blinking. He had made decisions that changed the shape of whole neighborhoods. He had sat across tables from people who wanted him dead and eaten dinner without his hand shaking. But right now, his chest felt like it had been split open with something dull and slow. 8 months. She had been gone for 8 months. He had turned cities inside out looking for her. He had called in every favor he owned, sent his best men to 3 countries, and gotten nothing back but silence and dead ends. Because she had been here. In a small bakery in a town that didn't appear on anyone's radar. Wearing a pale blue apron. Carrying his child. The thought hit him with the force of something physical. His child. He didn't know that for certain yet. But every cell in his body was already certain. He could feel it the way he always felt danger. Deep in the bone, beyond argument, beyond doubt. He took one slow step forward. Nadia's heart was slamming against her ribs so hard it hurt. Run. That was the only word her brain could form. Run. Get out. Through the back door, into the alley, down the street. She had done it before. She knew exactly how. She had practiced this moment in her head 100 times during the long, sleepless nights since she had disappeared from his life. But her feet would not move. She was fixed in place, staring at Dante across the width of the bakery, and her body had simply refused the instruction her fear was screaming at it. He was walking toward her now. Slowly. Each step deliberate and quiet, like he had all the time in the world and every intention of using it. His 2 large bodyguards stayed near the door, their backs to the room, watching the street outside. Nadia's hands pressed flat against the counter behind her. She had told herself, every single night for 8 months, that she had made the right choice. That leaving had been the only way. That she had done it to protect him, even if he would never understand. But seeing him now, seeing the raw, barely controlled emotion in those dark eyes, she couldn't remember how the logic of it had ever made sense. He stopped 3 feet away from her. Nadia, he said. Her name in his voice sounded like something that had been broken for a long time and was only now, in this moment, being held up to the light. Nobody in Rosie's bakery needed to be told twice. The tall bodyguard nearest the door, a broad-shouldered man named Bruno with a jaw like a fist, simply turned from the window and looked at the room. That was enough. Chairs scraped back. People gathered their bags and coats with hands that weren't quite steady. The teenagers dropped their phones into their pockets without looking at their screens first. Within 30 seconds, the bakery had emptied. Mr. Patel, the small, round owner who had operated Roses for 22 years without a single dramatic incident, stood behind the counter with both palms pressed flat on the glass case. Bruno approached him quietly, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and placed a thick fold of cash on the counter without a word. Mr. Patel picked it up. He glanced at Dante. He glanced at Nadia. Then he walked into the back, pulled the curtain closed, and did not come out again. The front door was locked. The sign was flipped to closed. And suddenly it was just the 2 of them, plus 2 silent men who might as well have been furniture, in a small bakery that smelled like cinnamon and warm bread and the particular kind of fear that has nowhere left to run. Dante had not moved his eyes from her. "How long have you been here?" he asked. His voice was quiet. Controlled. But the quiet was the kind that lives just before something very loud. "You look tired," Dante said. It was not what Nadia had expected him to say. Of all the things she had imagined him saying, and she had imagined it, because a part of her had always known this day would come, it had not been that. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You are not fine." He said it gently, but with a certainty that allowed no argument. His gaze moved over her face, the shadows under her eyes, the thinness of her cheeks, the way she was pressing the small of her back against the counter as if her body needed the support. "Dante." "How long?" he asked. She blinked. "What? How long have you been hiding here?" He said it the way someone might ask about the weather. Calm. Quiet. Controlled. But underneath the calm, she could hear something that made her hands tremble. Something that was not calm at all. She didn't answer. He took one more step forward, reducing the space between them to almost nothing. She had to tilt her head slightly to look up at him. She could smell the familiar scent of his jacket, something expensive, something that made her chest ache. "The baby," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Is the child mine?" The question settled into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples reached every corner of the room. Nadia opened her mouth. The logical, survival-driven part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive and hidden for 8 months, said one word: lie. Say no. Say it belongs to someone else. Say anything that makes him walk back out that door and leave her in peace. But she looked into his eyes, and the lie dissolved before it reached her lips. His eyes were not angry. That was the thing that undid her completely. They were not the cold, commanding eyes of Dante Varro, heir to one of the most feared crime families on the eastern seaboard. They were the eyes of a man standing at the edge of something enormous, terrified of what the answer might be, and even more terrified of a lie. She had seen that exact look on his face only once before, the night he had first told her he loved her. Yes, she said. The word came out small and cracked and completely honest. He is yours. The effect was immediate and devastating. The control in Dante's face didn't shatter all at once. It went in pieces, a tremor in his jaw, a sudden brightness in his eyes, a slow exhale that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. He looked down at her belly for a long moment. Then he looked back up at her face. "A boy?" he asked. She nodded. He said nothing for a while. The silence was enormous. Nadia watched the emotion move through him and felt the old grief rise in her chest like water through a cracked wall. She had not wanted to leave him. She needed him to know that, more than she had ever needed anything. But the words kept getting stuck somewhere between her heart and her mouth, blocked by the memory of a night 8 months ago that had changed everything. She had been alone in Dante's penthouse in the city when the call came. Not from Dante, he had been in Rome that week for a meeting with European associates. The call had come from a man whose voice she recognized immediately, even though he had never once spoken to her directly before. Aldo Varro, Dante's uncle. The man who had built the family's networks before Dante was old enough to understand what the family was. She had answered because she thought it might be news about Dante. Because she had always been foolish enough to love a man whose world made love a dangerous thing to carry. "Miss Cole," Aldo had said, in a voice as smooth and cold as polished stone. "I hope I haven't caught you at a bad time." He had. He had caught her at the exact worst moment of her life, even though she hadn't known it yet. "I've been meaning to speak with you," he continued pleasantly, "about your relationship with my nephew." She had gripped the phone tighter and said nothing. Nadia had stood in Dante's penthouse, surrounded by his furniture, his books, his expensive things that she had slowly, quietly begun to think of as theirs, and listened to Aldo Varro dismantle her life with the calm efficiency of a man following a plan he had prepared a long time ago. "Dante is not simply a man," Aldo had said. "He is a symbol. He is the future of this family. His partner, when he chooses one, must strengthen us. She must have the right connections and the right standing. She must be a fortress for him, not a gap in the wall." Nadia had said nothing. She already knew what was coming. "You are a weakness, Miss Cole. You are kind and soft and completely ordinary. And our enemies have noticed that Dante is different when he is around you. Slower. Less focused. They see you and they see a door that can be opened." "I love him," she had said. It sounded thin even to her own ears. "Yes," Aldo had replied. "That is precisely the problem." Then he had said the words that still lived behind her eyes like a splinter she could not reach, no matter how she tried. "The Ferrante family has been watching this building for 3 weeks. They have already started asking questions about you. If you are still here when Dante returns from Rome, if you are still in his life in any form, they will find a way to use you against him. And when that happens, he will not think clearly. He will start a war this family is not ready to win." Nadia had sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa. "You have 2 options," Aldo Varro had said. His voice had not changed in tone or warmth, because there had been no warmth to begin with. "You leave. Tonight. You disappear completely, and Dante is told that you ended it. I will give you the words to use. You were never serious about him. You were drawn to his name and his money. You felt trapped. He will be angry. He will be hurt. But he will survive, and the Ferrante will lose interest when the vulnerability has been removed." Nadia had felt something tear loose inside her chest. "Oh," she managed. "Or you stay," Aldo had said. "And within 2 weeks, the Ferrante will make their move. Dante will react the way young men with power always react, with rage and without strategy. He will start a war. People will die. Not just enemies. Our people. His closest men. And eventually, when they have taken everything they want from the situation, they will dispose of you as well. Because you will no longer be useful. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to make her feel its full weight. I have already prepared a travel bag. It is in the hallway closet. There is enough money inside to build a quiet life somewhere sensible. I suggest you use it well and use it wisely. The line went dead. Nadia had sat on the floor of Dante's penthouse for nearly an hour before she stood up, walked to the closet, and picked up the bag. She had called him from a bus station 3 cities away. It was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. Harder than the long, dark bus ride. Harder than checking into a cheap motel under a name that wasn't hers. Harder than all the nights that followed, when she lay in strange beds in strange rooms and pressed her face into flat, unfamiliar pillows and tried to keep the sounds inside. Dante had answered on the second ring. He was laughing at something in the background. She could hear Rome in the noise behind him, the warm sounds of a restaurant, men talking, someone saying his name. Nadia, he had said warmly. I was just thinking about you. She had closed her eyes. Then she had said the lines Aldo had given her, word for word, the way you recite something you have memorized but do not believe. She didn't love him. She had never loved him, not really. She had been drawn to his power and his world. She was tired of pretending. She was ending it. She delivered every word exactly as she had been instructed. The laughter on his end stopped instantly. The silence that followed was the longest silence she had ever lived inside. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely unrecognizable, low, broken in a way she had never heard from him before. Nadia. She had hung up. Then she had put the phone on the floor of the bus station bathroom and brought her heel down on it. 2 weeks after she left, sitting alone in a small apartment in a town she had chosen by pointing blindly at a map, Nadia took the test. She already knew what it would say. Her body had been telling her for days, the deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix, the faint nausea that hit her every morning like a slow wave. She had bought the test at a pharmacy 3 towns over, paid in cash, kept her cap pulled low. The line appeared within 30 seconds. She sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time, holding the test in both hands, staring at it. Part of her wanted to call him immediately, consequences be damned, and say, Dante, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it. There's something you need to know. But Aldo's voice was still too fresh in her memory. The Ferrante are watching. He will start a war. People will die. She pressed both hands against her still flat stomach. Yes. Another silence. He told you the Ferrante were watching the building. That they would use you if you stayed. Yes. He said you would react with anger instead of strategy. That you would start a war the family wasn't ready for. Dante was quiet for a long time. Then he stood and walked to the window, his back to her, looking out at the city below. She could see his reflection in the glass, his expression, just barely, before he controlled it again. When he turned back around, something had settled in his face. The mask was back. Harder than before. He wasn't wrong about the Ferrante, he said quietly. They were watching then. And they are watching now. He looked at her. Which means you were never actually safe. The weight of that landed in the room like something solid. It happened at 2 in the morning. Nadia woke from a shallow, restless sleep to a pain so sharp and sudden that it tore a cry from her throat before she was fully conscious. She gripped the edge of the bed with both hands, gasping, trying to breathe through it the way the pamphlet from her midwife appointment had told her to. The pain eased. Then came again, harder. The baby was not due for 7 weeks. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone on the nightstand, the one Dante had placed there before they said goodnight. His private number was the only contact saved in it. He answered before the second ring had finished. Nadia. His voice was alert immediately. He had not been sleeping either. The baby, she managed. Something's wrong. The pain, it's. Another wave seized her and her breath disappeared completely. She couldn't finish the sentence. 2 seconds of silence on his end. Exactly 2. Then his voice came back, and it was the most focused, most present sound she had ever heard from him. I'm coming right now. Stay on the phone. Don't hang up. Tell me, is the pain coming and going or is it one long pain? Coming and going. Okay. Deep breaths. Count with me. I'm already in the hallway. The door to her room opened 25 seconds later. He was already on his feet, jacket in hand, eyes locked on her face. Dante carried her to the car himself. She told him she could walk. He did not respond to that. He simply lifted her, one arm under her knees and one behind her back, and moved with a speed and focus that cleared every hallway they passed through without a single word being spoken. Bruno was already in the driver's seat when they reached the lobby. The engine was running. At the hospital, Dante did not use the emergency entrance. Bruno had called ahead during the drive. There were people waiting. Nadia was moved to a private room with a team who worked quickly and without questions. She wasn't sure if that was because they were simply very professional, or because of who was paying for her care. She was too far into the pain to care about the answer. Dante stayed. She had expected him to wait outside, composed, unreachable, separate from the raw and frightening business of what was happening. That was what men like him did. They managed things from a distance. But he stayed. He pulled a chair to the side of her bed. He held her hand. He wiped her face with a cool cloth the nurse brought. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, sometimes in English, sometimes in Italian. Phrases she couldn't always follow but didn't need to understand, because they were not about the words. They were about the sound. About staying anchored. It took 4.5 hours. At 20 minutes past 6 in the morning, a small, furious cry split the room open like light through a window. The doctor placed the baby in Nadia's arms. He was small. Red-faced. His tiny fists were clenched tight, and he was not happy about being in the world yet. His cry was enormous for something so small, like he had something very important to announce and was not going to stop until someone listened. Nadia looked up at Dante. He was standing beside the bed, and he was not the man who had walked into the bakery yesterday morning. He was not the controlled, dangerous, immovable force the world knew and feared and stepped aside for. He was just a man, standing at the side of a hospital bed with red eyes and a face that had run out of defenses. "Can I hold him?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper. She had never heard him sound like that before in her life. She lifted their son toward him. Dante reached out with hands that were, for the only time she had ever witnessed, trembling. He took the baby carefully. Impossibly carefully. He adjusted his grip twice, making sure the tiny head was supported. Then he stood very still, looking down at the small, wrinkled face. His chest rose and fell once. Slow. Deep. "He's real," Dante said. It wasn't a question. It was something he was telling himself, because some part of him still couldn't fully believe it. "He's real," Nadia confirmed softly. Dante looked at her then. 8 months of searching lived in that look. And underneath all of it, burning through the grief and the loss and the questions, something bright. "What will we call him?" he asked. Nadia had been turning names over in her head for months. During the quiet evenings in her small rented room above the laundromat, when she talked to her belly and pretended she wasn't afraid, she had tried on dozens of names and let most of them go. But there was one she kept coming back to. One that felt true. "Leo," she said. "Like a lion." Dante looked down at his son. The baby had stopped crying, which felt like a small miracle. One tiny hand had found Dante's finger and was gripping it with a fierceness that seemed completely out of proportion with something so new and so small. Dante almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way. But it was close, and with him, close meant something. "Leo," he repeated quietly, as if weighing the word. Then, "Leo Varro." He said the surname like a door being locked from the inside. A few minutes later, after the nurses came and went, and Nadia was resting with Leo asleep on her chest, Dante pressed a kiss to her forehead and stepped out into the hallway. She could hear him through the half-open door. His voice was quiet and completely level. "Uncle Aldo," he said. "We need to talk." Just 4 words. But the way he said them made the air in the corridor seem to drop several degrees. Nadia held Leo a little closer, closed her eyes, and waited for the reckoning she had known was coming. She could not hear all of it. She heard pieces, drifting in through the half-open door, and she filled the gaps with what she knew of him. She told me everything. A pause. His uncle must have spoken. I don't want your explanation. Another pause. Longer. You made a decision about my life without my knowledge. About my family. You sent the woman I loved away using fear as a weapon, and you gave her lines to recite so that I would be too angry to look for the real reason. So I would decide she was the problem instead of looking at you. Silence on his end for nearly a full minute. She imagined Aldo speaking, calm, measured, making his case. When Dante spoke again, his voice had dropped so low she almost lost it completely. I'm going to say this once, so I need you to listen with care. Nadia and Leo are my family. They will be recognized as such, publicly, and without delay. You will not speak against this to anyone in the family or outside it. And if the Ferrante come near my son, if they come within a mile of either of them, I will hold you responsible for every single consequence. Because it was your choices that left them exposed for 8 months. A brief pause. This is not a conversation, uncle. It is a notification. The hallway went quiet. Dante stood outside the door for a moment. Then he straightened his shoulders and walked back in. 3 days later, Dante called a meeting of the family's inner circle. They gathered in the private dining room of a restaurant that had been closed to the public for the evening. 12 men sat around a long, polished table. Senior members, long-serving lieutenants, the men who had built and protected the Varro family's position for decades. Aldo sat at the far end. His face, when Dante entered, was carefully neutral. Dante did not sit down. He stood at the head of the table and looked around the room without any hurry at all. By now, most of you have heard that I have a son, he said. His name is Leo Varro. His mother is Nadia Cole. She has been under my protection for 3 days. No one spoke. Some of you will have questions about her background. About whether she is a suitable mother for the next generation of this family. He let that sit in the air for a moment. I want to be clear about something. That question has already been answered. She raised our son alone, in hiding, in a town where nobody knew her name, for 8 months. She did it with no resources and no help and no one to call. She did it to protect our son and, she believed, to protect me. He paused. Then he looked directly at Aldo. That is the kind of strength this family should be grateful for. Not suspicious of. Not threatened by. He let the silence do its work. Aldo Varro sat very still for a long moment. The other men around the table watched him. Everyone in that room understood what this moment was. It was a line drawn in the air between what the family had always been and what Dante intended it to become. Between the old way and the new. Aldo picked up the glass of water in front of him. Set it back down carefully. Looked at the table. Then he looked up at his nephew. She raised him alone, Aldo said quietly, as if thinking out loud. 8 months. Without asking anything of us. Yes, Dante said. Another silence. Then Aldo stood. He did not say the words aloud. Men like him rarely did. Words were for people who needed them. But he gave a single, stiff nod, first to Dante, and then, meaningfully, to the empty chair beside Dante that represented Nadia's place at this table. It was enough. The other men followed, one by one. Brief nods. Straightened backs. The quiet language of acknowledgement. The Ferrante problem was addressed within the week, quietly, through channels and pressure and the kind of communication that never appeared in writing. A message was delivered and clearly received. The 2 men who had been watching the street outside Nadia's building were gone before the week was finished, and no one came to replace them. The family had understood. Leo Varro was off limits. His mother was off limits. There were to be no further conversations on either subject. 6 weeks later, Nadia stood by the tall window in the penthouse apartment that Dante had made their home. Leo was finally, blissfully asleep in the next room, after 40 minutes of the specific, determined resistance that only newborns are fully capable of. The city hummed and glittered below the glass. It was late, and the streets had thinned out, and the sky had that deep blue color it only gets in the last quiet hour before morning. She felt Dante come up behind her. He didn't touch her. He just stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solid presence of him, which had always felt like the safest thing in the world to her even when she was running from it. "He has your nose," Dante said. "He has your frown," she replied. Dante made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close. And with him, close was significant. They stood in silence for a while, looking out at the city. Then he spoke. "I should have found you sooner," he said. "You didn't know where to look. I should have looked harder." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had first seen in a hospital room, the one that appeared when he had held his son and let himself stop being Dante Varro for 5 minutes. "We're here now," she said. He reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. His hand stayed there for a moment against her cheek. "Yes," he said. "We are." In the next room, Leo made a small, soft sound in his sleep, not quite a cry, just a murmur, like he was commenting on a dream. Both of them turned instinctively toward the sound. Both of them relaxed at the same moment, when the quiet returned. Dante looked back at Nadia. Something in his face was different from the man who had walked into that bakery 6 weeks ago. The hard, hollow edges were still there, they would always be there. But they were no longer the only thing. There was something else now. Something that hadn't been there before. He was getting better at letting it show. What comes next for Dante, Nadia, and Leo? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to find out, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next chapter of their story. Morals. Silence can be a form of love, but it has a cost. Fear is a weapon that powerful people use against the ones you love. Running from danger doesn't make it disappear. True strength is choosing family over power. The people who hurt us most are often the ones we trusted most. A child deserves to be known by both parents. It is never too late to tell the truth.